My name is Matthew Carroll. I'm here to discuss ESD, or Energy System Development. One of the major issues that we kind of fall into in the exercise community is that we use acronyms for a lot of things, and we don't actually explain what the acronyms are and why they're important. So what I'm going to do is for Exos' ESD, I'm actually going to explain what ESD is, why it's important, and then in later lectures break down each component of ESD, talk about why you should be doing this in your programs. So what we're going to do is actually look at the definition of energy system development. Well, basically what we're doing here is we're targeting the individual needs and demands. Think each session that we do is going to be specific training response to the body, and therefore develop a metabolic infrastructure that is required to achieve success. So that's a big fancy term. So what am I talking about here? Well, when we think about cardio, we want to think of it as a spectrum. So instead of saying, you know what, I'm just a runner, I'm going to run 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and I'm just training for the 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to expand my spectrum, and I'm going to work on power, speed power, and I'm also going to work on my slow runs and my moderate runs. So for Exos, we kind of use these terms as red, green, and yellow zone trainings. So what I'm going to do now is actually kind of talk about the energy systems. So how long are the energy systems, and what are the energy systems? Well, the first one we kind of talk about is alactate, which is roughly about that 2 seconds. That's the initial sprint when we first start taking off, and that's an anaerobic capacity. And the second would be lactate, which is about 10 to 30 seconds. Again, still fall into the anaerobic state. Then we kind of fall into like glycolysis, which is 30 seconds to 2 minutes, where we kind of get that balance between anaerobic capacity and aerobic capacity. And then the final part is for our Krebs cycle is 2 minutes plus, where its majority of it is aerobic, but there is still components of anaerobic capacity. So one of the things when you look at this, you kind of say, why is there aerobic and anaerobic on a couple of these? Well, the thing about it is that even though we're in an anaerobic, or the body doesn't have the ability to provide enough oxygen to meet a bigger demand, we're still providing the body oxygen. About 10 years ago, this thought process of anaerobic was that we were in a vacuum where there's no oxygen, but that's not true anymore. We are always providing the body oxygen. We're just not providing the body enough oxygen to provide the body to use more energy systems. So when we look at these definitions of aerobic, think of it as an exercise that stimulates the heart rate and breathing rate to increase in a way that we can sustain the exercise for a duration. So when you want to think about it is, I'm going from a long run, my anaerobic capacity, I'm still providing quick bursts of energy to think when you start off with. We're still providing that energy system, but for the most part, the body is reaching enough oxygen to sustain that exercise. The way you kind of want to think about this is my next picture. So why is this important? Well, we have two major components for energy systems, and it's our fat and carbohydrate. So CHO stands for carbohydrate. So when you think about it, fat actually provides majority of the energy. So when we're walking around in a daily movement, we're actually using our fat. Our fat's being broken down to provide energy, and there's very little amount of carbohydrates that are providing the body energy. So then what happens is that for the low intensity, we have this burning of fats and very little burning of carbohydrates. And as the intensity increases, we kind of see a shift in that. So we see that fat decreases and carbohydrates increase. So the higher intensities, we're actually burning carbohydrates versus burning fats. So why is this important? Well, a lot of the time what we end up doing is when we go out and for that 20-minute run, we sit there and go, I'm going to be working at low intensity, jump onto that treadmill, we think I'm running at a 55% intensity, nice slow jog, and you're thinking I'm just going to be burning fat the whole entire time. What actually ends up happening is that we kind of see a shift in that. So we see that the carbohydrates play a larger role because the body has to go from the anaerobic state to back to that aerobic state because your body's not used to doesn't have enough oxygen to sustain that aerobic component until we reach a certain point. So what happens is that we fall into this, since I'm running for 20 to 30 minutes, my body makes that shift to carbohydrate, and so for that 20 to 30 minutes, the body is actually burning carbohydrates instead of fat. And so even when we jump off, we're thinking, you know what, congratulations to me, burn a bunch of fat. What I've actually done is burn a bunch of carbohydrate, and that the fat sustains. So how do we actually burn that fat? Well, they've actually shown that about 30 minutes, roughly 30 minutes, you see that shift back into that fat burning. So if I stay for that 55%, I'm going to see that shift come back about in that 30 minutes, and anytime after that, I'm going to be burning fat. So the theory on this actually turned into the heart zone training, is saying, you know what, if I did work at a low intensity, or my heart rate work intensity, and I sustain that for long periods of time, I see that shift and I'm going to start burning that fat. What I love about the Exos ESD is that it takes that and actually kind of builds upon it and says, you know what, I'm going to work all the energy system, so I'm working the carbohydrates and I'm working the fats. The best way to show this is the 3 zones: green zone, red zone, and yellow zone. So when we look at this, we kind of fall into this. So what is a red zone? What is a green zone? And what is a yellow zone? What I'm going to do here is actually kind of explain it from a speed, power, and time component. So we're going to first look at red zone, because that in the next lecture, I'm actually going to talk about red zone and why it's so important, even though most people don't actually do the red zone or the high intensity exercise. So what red zone is that high intensity. For this one, you think the speed and power, I'm going to be running that 50 meter, 200 meter, 400 meter. I'm going to be just booking it. I'm going as fast as possible. What we see is that we're involving a lot of high speed and high power. Because again, if you're running that 50 meter, I want to be as fast as possible. And so when we use that, we're using a high speed, high power, so we fall into the high intensity. And we kind of shift that over to that 15 to 20 minutes, and you see that green zone. You can kind of see how the speed and power has decreased, because again, if I'm sitting there and I'm trying to run for 15 minutes, there's no way that I'm going to sustain that 10-second sprint for 15 minutes. So you see how the speed and power decreases as time goes on, and then you fall back to even further to that 2 to 3 hour component, and saying, you know what, for the marathon runners, there's no way that I'm going to be able to sustain my red zone training for 2 to 3 hours. Well, there's different ways we can manipulate this. We look at the duration of it, do high intensity, short time sprints. I can increase it to a little bit more, to about 15 minutes to 20 minutes, and say, you know what, that's my moderate intensity. I'm going to push the work. And then the yellow is 30 minutes to 2 hours, 3 hours for that duration. Again, looking at the intensity, high, moderate, and low. Even though the intensities are different, it doesn't mean that I am working any less harder on my red zone to my green zone to my yellow zone. If I look at a marathon runner, and when he crosses that finish line, he is not all happy-go-lucky and jumping up and down. He is just dead tired. And then you look at the sprinters, again, look at the Olympic sprinters, and you look at them, and when they cross that finish line, they're dead, they're tired, they're spent. Again, even though the intensities are different, doesn't mean that the amount of work that they put in changes any less. And then different type of stimulus, where we can use treadmills, ellipticals, jump ropes, spin bikes. There's many components to this, and it's not just involving our cardio machines or tracks. We can even use this with weightlifting, where we do high intensity exercise, kind of falls into that HIIT or Tabata component. Then we look at loads on the body, and then pace and resistance. Again, pace, you want to think different types of speeds. Resistance could be the inclination. Changing the inclination for something could make the whole entire thing completely different. I can put you on a 10% incline, and that could be a yellow, but I increase the speed, that could be a green, that could be a red. So a bunch of these things play different components to this. We can manipulate this in many ways. Again, these are just 6. So what I'm going to do now is kind of talk broadly about these 3 zones, And again, later on in lectures, I'm actually going to break it down even further. So the first one we're going to kind of look at is the red zone. Again, think about this as the high intensity, quick bursts. So it's going to be high muscular, demanding for strength. With that, it's going to be a high caloric burn. We're going to be working on our blood lactate levels, and then we'll also be looking at our anaerobic power. So anaerobic power is the ability to work at high intensities for short durations, the 5 to 30 seconds, which is important for a lot of things. Again, jumping out of a chair, that is actually what we could talk about with power. So being able to provide the body with enough oomph to drive forward or drive to the left, drive to the right. Then we're going to talk about is green zone. So green zone is our moderate intensity. What we're working on is ventilation threshold, working the capacity for the body to be from aerobic to anaerobic. So if you think about it, for those people that were trying to increase their 5K, being able to work on their ventilation threshold, I can sustain my aerobic capacity to a better point before I start going into that carbohydratic or where I'm starting to produce that blood lactate. Again, the next one, increasing our blood lactate levels, so it's getting used to it. And then we're going to be talking about is our anaerobic capacity. So anaerobic capacity is the ability to work at high intensity for longer periods of time. And then we will also be working on aerobic power, which is the ability to sustain a lower intensity exercise for longer duration. So when we jump onto that treadmill or we go in for that 5K, we can actually push the tempo a little bit harder on it. So, but even though we're pushing a little bit harder, we're still staying in that component where we're using oxygen instead of falling into that anaerobic capacity where we're starting to build that lactate levels and where the body kind of says, you know what, I'm getting fatigued, I'm going to have to slow it down or I'm going to have to stop. So working on this, again, we're focusing on making sure that we push our body just a little bit further each time. And then our last one is our yellow zone, which is that low intensity, working on the blood flow in the body, increasing the capillary levels, we're feeding the muscles, we're increasing the capacity for the muscle fibers to generate more energy or ATP, where we're actually working on that endurance, being sustained for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, kind of working on just increasing the time of work. We can even treat yellow zone as a recovery day. So after you go on lifting or after a long, hard day and you just want to zone out, yellow zone is a fantastic one to actually do that. And then the last one, again, is working on that ventilation threshold, working on that aerobic capacity, trying to make sure that you can sustain that low intensity for a longer period of time. So again, I really appreciate you all for attending this and kind of listening to this, for attending. And if you have any questions, you can always email me at mcarroll@teamexos.com, or you're more than welcome to talk with any of your trainers at your sites. But thank you again for attending, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.